Hello, everyone. This is Yvette Kelly with the Community Technical Assistance Center. I'd like to welcome you to the From Residential to Community-Based Care Culture-Driven Leadership webinar. Before we get started, I just want to take a moment to orient everyone to the WebEx system so you know how to participate in today's event. If you have not done so already, please call into the webinar using the audio conference information found in the Event Info tab above the slide deck. Upon joining the webinar, you will be placed on mute to avoid background noises that may distract you from listening to the webinar. If at any time you come across any technical issues during the webinar, please chat to the host, Brianna, who will be able to assist you. You will also have the opportunity to submit questions to today's presenter by typing your questions into the chat box, which is located on the right side of your screen. If it does not appear, click the dialog bubble on the top right toolbar. It should pop up. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation, and we will address them during the question and answer session at the end of the presentation today. I also want to point out your ability to get a continuing education credit for attending the webinar today. But in order to do so, you'll need to log into the portal and create a profile if you have not already done so. Select today's webinar, pay a $15 processing fee, and then take the knowledge test. After the webinar has ended, you will receive a link to be able to do all of those things within 24 hours of this webinar. Okay. So again, just want to welcome you to today's webinar, which is part 2 in a 3-part series focused on efforts nationally to redesign the role of residential treatment services. I'd also like to mention that if you're just joining us today and did not have the opportunity to join us for the prior session, please feel free to go to ctacnews.com, and the copy of the recording will be on our website, and you can view it at a time that's feasible, and if you have any additional questions, you can submit them to us as well. Some of the strategies presented during this series will be action steps that you can do today, while there will be other strategies that won't be able to be realized until the state completes the transition to a value-based system. But nonetheless, we think it is important to note in considering all of the possibilities. So now I'd like to take the moment to introduce our presenter today, Bill Martone, whose work in residential treatment services includes rethinking and redefining the role of residential in the continuum of care. Before Bill gets started, though, I'm sorry, I just want to mention 2 more things, is that the part 3 of this series will be held on February 19th. Same time, 11 to 12, and it will be around performance excellence and measuring what matters, and some of the strategies and tools to really think about how your organization moves forward in documenting its great work and outcomes as children and families. Okay, so again, want to take a moment to introduce Bill, but before we get started, I'd like to see who has joined us today for the webinar. So if you could take a few minutes and just complete this poll question so we know who's on the line, that would be very helpful. And the next person that you will hear after we come back from the poll will be Bill Martone. We're going to give you a few minutes. A few more minutes for the results to come in. Okay, it looks like we have a lot of directors and administrators. We also have some supervisors, clinicians. Does not look like we have any administrative support folks on the line, but we do have family and youth care advocates and some others as well. So again, we just want to welcome everyone to the webinar, and I'm now going to pass it over to Bill Martone. And again, as I mentioned, Bill has had the experience of working on a number of projects around redesigning residential treatment and what that really takes, and some of the strategies and tools that you can utilize to be thinking about some of the strategies that you can implement as you move forward. So, Bill?
Thank you, Yvette. Good morning, everyone, and Happy New Year to everybody. Probably about 2 weeks ago, all eyes were turned on Pasadena for the annual Rose Parade, and I thought I'd give you a little bit of trivia to start the morning off. My former agency, the Sycamores, before it merged and became Hathaway Sycamores, was founded by a woman by the name of Fannie Rowland. Her husband, John Rowland, was one of the founders of the Tournament of Roses. So before it initially existed, John was involved in creating this event. The family was also involved in founding the Pasadena Humane Society. So we've always considered the Rowlands a very interesting family in Pasadena. Kids, animals, and parades came out of the Rowland family. So I wanted to start with a recap of last session. We spent time talking about emerging trends and some of the things that we expect to see in the future in our field. Talked about reinventing the organization, and I used the example of Hathaway Sycamores as part of that journey. We talked about assessing your organization and using the Building Bridges tool. We also talked about the Center for Public Skills Training and their toolkit for how to assess your organization. And then I had an opportunity to do a very brief overview of our residential RBS model. So today we're going to talk about culture, and we're going to talk about performance-based culture, performance excellence in culture and in change, and then in case I don't get to it, please go to the appendix in today's presentation, and there is some information from the Alliance for Strong Families and Communities and the Strategic Change Initiative on leading cultural adaptation. The goals for the series remain the same, and I won't spend time going through those. They were the same as last time, which is really strengthening, identifying the strengths of your organization, increasing your understanding, and increasing your enthusiasm for change. So, culture eats strategy for breakfast, a famous quote from Peter Drucker. Probably all of you have heard that. Let's think about culture for a moment in our organizations. Tom Wall from the Strategic Change Initiative really describes organizational culture like a big box warehouse that holds the sum of everything, every decision, anything that's ever happened in the organizations. All that you've taught, all the mistakes that we've made, all the stories ever told, it's that big, massive historical data bank. And Tom talks a lot about culture really teaching more to our staff than we ever do in our orientation sessions. That organizational culture has teachings on just about everything, including what color choices we make in our milieu, our menu selections, new projects the organization is going to work on, old historical things that we've done in the past, new directions, styles of leadership, sort of you name it, and it's in there. But when we look at organizational culture, there's a big piece of that culture that is kind of below the water. And Torben Rick from the UK, who worked in both Denmark and Germany and Switzerland, I think does a great job with this slide of representing the way we say things get done in our organizations, and that's our vision, our strategy, our shared values, our goals, our policies, our structures. But there's the way that we really get things done, and that's what we don't see and is below water. And those are the perceptions, the shared assumptions, the procedures, the values, the norms, the traditions that our organizations have, those unwritten rules, the stories we tell, the feelings our folks have. And that's really that invisible organizational culture. And I think it's important that we really recognize that that's there, and that's something that we deal with in our organizations on a regular basis. So I thought we'd take just a moment for you to think a little bit about what your own organizational cultures may look like. So here's a couple examples. What if, and I know this sounds kooky, we communicated with the employees? We have a dress code here. Only directors are allowed to wear bow ties. I want the public to think of us as a company with a heart, but I want you to think of us as the company that will chew you up, spit you out, and smear you into the carpet if you screw up. All of these are just some examples of what we say and what we do and what happens within a culture for our organization. So perhaps organizational culture could be defined as a self-sustaining pattern of behaving, feeling, thinking, and believing. So how do we influence organizational culture? Steve Denning talks about some different tools for changing people's minds. There's leadership tools, management tools, power tools. Some inspire, some inform, some intimidate. And as you see from this slide, there's really overlapping in each of these different areas. We all like to think we're inspiring through our leadership tools, but at times our management tools are also being utilized for changing folks' minds about what we're doing and how we're moving forward as an organization. And then there are times where those intimidation and power tools really get utilized within the organization. So what do organizations do in a performance-based culture? So those strong organizations potentially do 5 things very well, and those focus on leadership, decision-making, and structure, people, work and process systems, and culture. So in relationship to leadership, leadership is really sharing with people a clear vision and priorities, and there is a cohesive leadership team within the organization. In regards to decision-making and structure, there's clear roles and accountability for decisions, and the organizational structure that supports the objectives. In regards to our people in the organization, organizational individual talents necessary for success are the people that we're looking to bring into the organization and to maintain. And organizations utilize performance measures and incentives aligned to those objectives. In regards to work processes and systems, there's really a superior execution of programmatic work processes, effective and efficient support processes and systems, and that all leads to culture, which is high performance values and behavior and the capacity to change. So as you look at those organizations that do well in a performance-based culture, these are the characteristics that you might expect to see. So let's move on to leaders. What do leaders then do in a performance-based culture? So leaders take and manage accountability for organizational success. I'm going to come back and talk a little bit more about that when I share an example with you from my former agency of how we shifted and changed some of that. But that, to me, is a significant part of what we do to really be successful in a performance-based, performance-excellent culture. Leaders also build consensus, but are decisive when they need to act. They're constantly sensing both that internal and external environment and focusing on their customers, partners, employees' needs and satisfaction levels. I would ask you to think about how many of you view your customers and identify who your customers are in the organization and really focus on meeting those customer needs, pleasing your customer in terms of all that you're doing in your organization, and really focusing and using that language with all staff in your organization so they really have a sense around customer and customer care. There's some wonderful, interesting books out there, If My Organization Ran Like Disney, and some others that really talk about how to create that customer experience. Leaders also negotiate clear expectation and goals. They need to understand where the organization is going, what it's doing, and then share those throughout the organization with staff so everyone is really moving in that same direction. Leaders provide ongoing feedback and coaching and appraise performance periodically. We'll talk a little bit about some performance appraisal options that you might consider, but it's really important for staff in the organization to know how they're doing, are they meeting the expectations that are there, and are they focused on what the organization is trying to achieve and do. Leaders invest in talent development, really finding those innovators within the staff, unleashing that talent, and also planning for succession. And that's really an ongoing part of leadership, to really be looking at who's going to replace you, who's that next person on the staff that can really step up and do great things. Leaders are reflective and self-aware. They know themselves really well in order to know others, and they seek help from others in situations where their natural tendencies won't serve them as well. And that's really that self-awareness piece that makes the strong leaders in an organization so strong. Leaders adapt a coaching style of leadership that strengthens and supports coherence, communication, collaboration, and change within the organization. They are creating supportive, healthy cultures which attract and retain that talent that we talked about, and they promote balance and emotional well-being as a way of improving productivity and innovation and leveraging existing talent. So there's a real component of self-awareness in this list of skills, and a list of things to do to really support staff and make staff a key component of the work that goes on in the organization. And that is really staff at all levels, whether those are direct service staff, whether those are support folks, whether those are our parent advocates, our youth advocates in organizations. It's really coordinating all those layers together. So leading is developing. It's translating the vision to the line staff. It's personally demonstrating the values and cultures. Don't do as I say, do as I do. It's really about engaging all of the staff in the organization and providing supports to get that work done. And then I think one of the key areas of importance is really celebrating accomplishments. It's very important for the organization to celebrate its successes. We face continual challenges, we face continual audits in our organization, and we need to find ways to celebrate those successes that occur. You know, maybe it's a new program we've opened, maybe it's an audit we've successfully completed, maybe it's a team that's done a great job with a child and family. What are those successes? How do we share those? How do we support those within our staff? So Warren Bennis talks about leadership as the capacity to translate vision into reality, which I think is a wonderful quote. So I wanted to take a little bit of time and talk about the performance excellence journey that we took in my former organization of Hathaway Sycamores. So this is really a case example of what we did and how we began to address organizational excellence, a performance-based culture within an organization. The challenge for us really started in about 2008 and 2009 with the national recession. We were seeing a downturn in our donors. Our foundation giving was down. We were having deficit reduction happening in Washington, D.C., and we're really struggling fiscally. In California, we saw a budget crisis of $50 billion shortfalls. That is correct. It's with a B, billion-dollar shortfalls, which were really a significant challenge for the state. We were seeing program cuts. Our group home and our foster family agency, FFA, rates were cut by 10%. There were no cost of living adjustments in our mental health rates, and those cost of living adjustments were just not occurring anywhere, and we were seeing continued budget cuts and reductions throughout the state to really begin to deal with that shortfall. So we had some possible responses that we could begin to think about as an organization. One response was just to cut programs and staff and kind of match what was happening in the state. It's often the quickest but least effective because we know we're losing our talent, that when the economy recovers and came back, we would then have to retain, recoup, and build back again, because those good people would most likely be lost and not come back to us. We could reduce infrastructure and overhead, but those typically have long lead times, and we were in the midst of a crisis at the moment. Increasing revenue streams was another strategy, but in the face of those budget reductions, we couldn't find any new revenue streams, anyone that had any money that they were going to put in for new programs or new areas. We talked about mergers and acquisitions, and as you've seen in our name, and as I mentioned at the beginning, the Sycamores merged with Hathaway in 2005. We were still in 2008, 2009 in that merging mode and working through. So it's a high-risk endeavor, and it took a lot of time to really move through that merger. And then we looked at a strategy of reducing waste and inefficiency. And what it required was developing new skills and a change to our culture. But we really felt that this was a way to address what was needed in our organization at that time. So with that list of choices, we settled on that performance excellence direction and really began changing the way we did our work, our processes in the organization. And we believed we could create fiscal savings and potentially even increase our revenue if we embarked on this journey. We also felt that the journey would make us a better organization. So what started out for us as a fiscally focused endeavor quickly became an overall way that we saw to successfully improve all aspects of the agency. And some of the projects that we took on and did that I'm going to talk about in a moment started out fiscally focused. But you'll see as I go through some of the list of things that we looked at changing, that emphasis went away fairly quickly, and we really began looking at improving the organization and what we were doing. So the journey for us really started 13 years prior to 2008 with a decision to achieve joint accreditation through the Joint Commission. And that really began to create a desire for us to become a learning organization, and we began focusing on performance improvement efforts. Now, you have to put this in a little bit of perspective. The Joint Commission, I think, really took hold on the East Coast. The organization I was at in New York, Parsons Child and Family Center, probably in the mid-'70s, embraced Joint Commission, but that had not happened in California. When we became Joint Commission accredited at our agency, we were only one of 2 like organizations in the Los Angeles area that were Joint Commission accredited. So the Joint Commission had spread from the East Coast to the Midwest, but really didn't have a strong hold except in the hospital arena on the West Coast. That's changing now, and we are requiring accreditation as part of the membership for our state association. So accreditation is something on all agencies' mind these days, and as a little prelude to some of what we're seeing in the federal financing reform, the words about organizations being accredited are being tossed around in that effort. So there were 2 tools that we embraced shortly after we became Joint Commission accredited, and then really embraced as we began the Performance Excellence journey. And those were the Team Handbook and the Leader's Handbook. And I would encourage those of you interested to obtain those, especially the Team Handbook. I believe they're still available on Amazon. And we really relied on that Team Handbook for our training and developing the training that we were going to use with staff on this journey. We also discovered something, because we attempted this journey when we first became accredited by the Joint Commission and tried to self-sustain those efforts. And we found it was difficult for us to keep that momentum up as an organization. And when we began the Performance Excellence journey, we brought consultants on board to help us, to help provide the direction, and we made much more significant gains with the consultants being on board than we did trying to self-sustain a journey on our own. So how can organizations really take a look at performance excellence and what they're doing, and how's it measured? There's a lot of tools out there, the International Organization for Standardization, California Awards for Performance Excellence, the Malcolm Baldrige Award, excuse me, for National Quality. And these are the Malcolm Baldrige standards. They're in the California Awards for Performance Excellence, and they really focus on 7 areas. They focus on leadership, that's both internal leadership and external leadership, strategic planning, client and customer focus, and I highlighted that a little bit earlier, but that is very much a key for organizational excellence, measurement, analysis, and knowledge management, workforce focus, which I indirectly highlighted earlier about the importance of our workforce, process management, and results. So these are the areas that an organization can use to look at how it's doing and what's happening. There were, at the time when we first did this in 2009, about 80 organizations that had been recognized for high performance by the Department of Commerce. And the Malcolm Baldrige Award is focused in different areas of education, healthcare, not-for-profits, and the government sectors. And each of the standards vary a little bit within those. So our consultants did an analysis of the organization. This was not a full-blown study, but really took a look at where they thought we were at as an organization in 2009. And we were quite surprised by where we fell. We did not see ourselves falling in the kind of poor to fair or maybe creeping into the fair to good arena. We saw ourselves much higher as we looked at our organization. But when we started comparing ourselves to these standards, the results were really accurate of how we were doing. In 2012, the same consultants went back and did another evaluation, and we had made progress pushing ourselves into the very good range over those 3 years. And I'll talk with you a little bit more in a minute. Probably one more year time, 2013, and we had pushed ourselves even a little bit higher into that range 4 arena. but you can see it is a journey, and it didn't happen for us very quickly. So what those organizations, and if you look at the poor to fair, the fair to good, the very good, and the excellence, one of the key things that we're talking about is alignment. And where we were falling with our fair to poor results was not being very aligned as an organization. And this was alignment with our mission, our vision, our values. We defined ourselves in many ways as we look back at that first stage in 2009 as really having multiple initiative disorder. We were doing many, many things, but those many, many things were not in a cohesive plan. They were not organized for the organization overall. And as we began to improve, we began to see that alignment start to shift. And the arrows got pointed in the same direction. Our efforts were beginning to move in that same effort. Still highly desirable of that excellence in an organization where everything is perfectly aligned. We saw in the 4 years we worked on this project just how difficult it is to achieve that type of alignment in an organization. So the initial steps in our journey really started by creating what we called a transformational team. This was a team that we designed to work on this journey with us. I, as the CEO, invited 6 people to join with me on this journey, along with our executive leadership team. And it was a journey that we weren't sure at the time where it was going to lead us. We, as the executive leadership team, picked an array of staff. Their titles were Director of Accreditation Services and Staff Development, an Assistant Program Director for Wraparound, Assistant Vice President of Quality Assurance and Privacy Officer, a Director of Evaluation and Research, a Program Director for Outpatient, and an Assistant Program Director for Human Resources. These were scattered. They were purposefully designed to cut across different roles within the organization. And I asked these people to kind of join us on this journey that we hoped was going to be transformational for the organization. We knew was going to require a lot of effort on their part, but we knew would hopefully help them in their careers as they move forward. Our executive leadership team had gone through a 2-day intensive training out of the leadership handbook, the team handbook, and began looking at the components that we really needed to address performance excellence transformation. We then took this transformational team off-site for 3 days and provided intensive training for them during that 3-day period to really begin to get them orientated to that change. One of the other significant changes we began as part of this process was changing the executive leadership team's role within the organization. The executive leadership team was perceived in the organization as responsible for what happened in the organization. We reported and worked with the board of directors. Obviously, the CEO reported, but the executive leadership team was the group that went to board meetings and was perceived as really the people responsible for running the organization. And we discovered that we needed to change that mindset in the organization, that the responsibility for running the organization and leadership was not driven down to that next level or even lower within the organization. If there was a problem, if there was a fiscal problem, it was the executive leadership's team problem. It wasn't the vice president's, the next level of management. And we really worked on shifting that perception and making changes to that really drove that level of responsibility to the next layer of management through the organization. We use teams. We use project teams in the work that we did. Those teams were multidisciplinary. It was crucial to have folks from all different roles in the organization involved in those teams as we addressed different projects. There were people that were in leadership roles that would have no clue about how things operated in certain areas of the organization, in certain programs, for certain groups of staff. And we really needed those various groups of staff, from parent partners to youth advocates to child care workers to program folks from all of our different program areas involved in what we were doing on these project teams. We then created what was called an oversight council. It was a process council to oversee that work. And we began to see the benefit of creating councils for how we organized our work. And we talked a lot about developing future councils. So this project really had 3 areas of focus. The first was working in teams. The second was process management. And the third was line of sight measurement. If it was important, we needed to measure it and we needed to report on it so that people knew it was important within the organization. So this performance excellence journey really required an attitudinal shift for us. And it's that shift from, yeah, we're pretty good, to, yeah, maybe we could be world class, and how you move along that journey. We were really starting out at the unconscious incompetence stage, and we wanted to move through to that unconscious competence stage where it just happened naturally and wasn't something we had to think about. But to get there, we really had to move through the conscious incompetent, which was figuring out, hey, we're really not as good as we thought we were, and we really needed to make some changes as we compare ourselves against these national quality standards. And then you begin to move into that sort of conscious competence stage, but you have to work really, really hard at it. And I'm not sure that we ever got into the unconscious competence stage as an organization. That is really a special stage for an organization to move through. So kind of some random thoughts on the nature of change. Change would be easy if it weren't for all the people. It's people that don't resist change, they resist being changed. 95% of all the changes have nothing to do with improvement. Change requires knowledge. Improvement requires wisdom. Changing the outside seldom changes the inside. So building that new organizational structure chart isn't going to improve your system. It is like building that new garage, and it doesn't make the Yugo that's inside of it a Lexus. So calling your current bosses or team leaders doesn't make them that. It really takes a change, an attitudinal change, to begin to develop those skills we talked about earlier. And then a lot of disciplines want to preserve and protect that status quo. So we found all of these as part of what we encountered in that change process. One, though, that really stuck for us was the 85-15 rule. And we learned that 85% of the issues, problems that we were struggling with, needing to correct or address, were process problems. They were not people problems. And as we began to understand that better and really delve into that, that really held true for us. If we changed the process, we got better results for the organization. Changing the people was a very small part of what we needed to look at. So I mentioned one leg of those stools was building a team culture and working within teams. We looked at lots of ways to improve our team work. We began doing some 360 evaluations. We developed directive supervision, which is a Pat Miles tool out of Wraparound that she helped train the organization in for providing support to those individuals doing the direct work. We did a lot of looking at team maturity and the nature of teams. We created different roles within the organization of sponsors, coaches, and team leaders that we utilized. So that team-based culture that we really began focusing on was utilized for our projects. The four roles, which I think are well defined in the team handbook, but basically the sponsor is a manager who's identified the needs that have to be improved, the project that we're working on, where those improvements are needed, and reviews and supports the work of the teams. The coaches are the people with data analysis and team building skills, so they've been trained in the techniques, who teach and support the team leaders and team members in using those selected tools and methods to help facilitate the team's work. The team leaders are people who orchestrate team activities, maintain the team records, and serve as a communication link with the rest of the organization. And then team members, as I mentioned already, come from all parts of the organization. They're people appointed by the team sponsor and team leader who share their knowledge, experience, and expertise while working to accomplish the team's work. So those became the basis for the roles that we used in this project. I mentioned the Team Maturity Index. Those of you that are familiar with group development will see this is very familiar material, the forming, storming, norming, performing types of group development that goes on. So leadership really starts out doing a lot of managing in the early stages of putting these teams together, and not a lot of empowering. But as that team moves on to more of a high-performing team, the leadership is really empowering that team and doing much less managing of the team. And you can see some of the activities that are going on with the team in each of these different steps, really leading towards self-direction and insight into the process that they're using, developing their own individual strengths and satisfaction with the results. We saw real pride come out of those teams as we took on different projects within the organization. So leadership is really driving alignment, going back to those arrows. We're creating structures that communicate. We're creating meeting structures and mindful measurement, all the things that we're doing to drive that appropriate alignment. We talked a lot about our cascading leadership system. I mentioned our executive leadership team and the next layer of the organization. That was about 8 people. As it had grown, it started out with 5 people and grew. Our leadership team was about 20 people, managing all the different aspects of the organization. And our management leadership team was probably about 120 staff, overseeing all the different parts of the organization. The management leadership team were directors, people that had supervisory responsibility. The leadership team were vice presidents and assistant vice presidents in the organization. And then the executive leadership team was the executive vice presidents in the organization. The training that we did really cascaded along with these various teams. We trained the executive leadership team, the process council that oversaw all of our projects. We drove that training into the leadership team. We drove it down to our management team, and all 120 managers received that training. And we began moving some of that training on to our line staff. Second leg of that stool really looked at process management. And process management really focuses on, and as the 85-15 rule states, 85% of where we could really impact change was around how we did the work. It was the processes within the organization. It was looking at rapid improvement technology, plan, do, check, act, various processes to help us do that work. So there's really a couple different views of the organization. There's that traditional view, and then there's a process view that really applies the science of process management to the organization, works in cross-functional teams, and really measures and reports on the work that it does. And that was a direction that we were moving and really wanted to get to. So if one looks at the suppliers and inputs that lead into the process and then the outputs of what you're looking for, I often like to kind of use the analogy of pizza making. You've got the ingredients, you've got the flour, the water, the sauce, the toppings. Those are the supplies and the inputs that's there. The process is putting that pizza together. And you may test, do I bake it at 500 degrees? Do I bake it in a 750-degree oven? All of those things that we might change in that process, do I put more sauce on, more cheese, less cheese, really changes the outputs that we see and the satisfaction that we then have with our customers. So there's a lot of examples of processes, from complicated delivering residential care, operating outpatient mental health services, hiring staff, our billing processes, our evidence-based practice processes. All of those are processes that we can look at in this kind of approach. Plan, Do, Check, Act is probably a more common way of looking at this cycle of improvement, identifying the purpose and goals and formulating a theory of how you're going to measure success and plan for an activity. The do is the executing that plan, undertaking the activities and producing the interventions and applying the best knowledge. Then you check and monitor the outcomes that you're getting. How is that pizza? Is it tasting good or isn't it? Testing those theories and planning, studying the results of what you got, and then acting is integrating what you've learned, checking and reformulating. So I'm not going to use a 500-degree oven. I'm going to use a 750-degree oven to really get a better product. We took that Plan, Do, Check, Act process, and you're seeing the team handbook, if you look at it, an 8-step improvement. We found as we got into this, we could eliminate some of those steps and really move to a 5-step improvement process. As you kind of lay that against the Plan, Do, Check, Act, the first is defining the problem. What is the issue that we're dealing with? Our hiring process is such that our orientation is taking 2 weeks. We're telling people the same thing several times during that 2-week period, and people are not showing up on time for their session of the orientation. It was an example of where we saw a lot of issues in defining our hiring process. You then sort of map and measure and take a careful look at what that process is that exists today. Third step is really analyzing root causes. What are the issues that are causing this problem and really beginning to dig in and understand those? Then you begin to identify solutions and begin to implement those solutions. We do those in pilot approaches, so it's small before you take a project to full implementation. And then it's really moving on to how does one hold the gains in that process. So those 5 steps, defining, measuring, analyzing, improving, and controlling, have lots of subcomponents within them. And this gives you a sense of what each of those components is within that process. The projects that we took on had several things in common that we really felt made successful projects for us to use a performance excellence process approach with. That the scope was well-defined and unambiguous, that the key outcomes were easy to measure. We were only looking at measuring 1 or 2 of those outcomes. We wanted those projects to last not more than 6 months as we began our early projects, and we're really training the team in the use of these tools. We found it took much longer than 6 months for us to complete them, but that was our goal. We wanted the projects to focus on quality and revenue improvement, and as from where I started, the financial challenges that we had were really what we wanted to initially address, but we then moved on to organizational areas that really improved the organization. We wanted to generate interest with our broad organization, that everybody could get interested and behind a project. We wanted to pick low-hanging fruit where we could make significant changes. And our first projects were designed to save us at least $150,000 in cash. I don't want to spend much time on implementation science, but I do want to recognize its importance in human service project management. Dean Fixon, who's the father of implementation science, really has done analysis looking at projects that use implementation science and projects that don't. And what you see is when this type of science is utilized, 80% of desired outcomes can be achieved in 3 years, versus 14% of desired outcomes achieved in 17 years. Utilizing this approach really makes a significant difference. So to kind of conclude, the first 3 projects that we did were on mileage, how we reimbursed our employees for their mileage. When I talked about those arrows that weren't aligned, we had probably about 13 sites. We discovered we had 13 processes for dealing with mileage. Each manager had sort of developed their own. When we went through utilizing these tools, we were able to save in our reimbursement by changing our practices of how we reimburse for mileage almost $500,000. The new employee orientation process that we changed, and this is probably not counting for all of the savings by reducing our orientation, saved us at least $100,000. And then we looked at our mental health billing process and where we were not billing for short interventions that staff were providing. They didn't think it was worth billing for a 5-minute time period, and we were able to recoup significant dollars there. So as I look at the projects, they started out on that fiscal level that I talked about, and then as you look at Project 4, really got into redesigning our mental health workflow. We looked at our electronic health record system and ended up purchasing a new one. We looked at our work from home policies and protocols and how could we let staff work from home. We looked at workforce planning, recruiting, and hiring. We looked at recognition, rewards, and retention. We looked at our core practice model with measurement systems for quality services. We looked at customer satisfaction and integration of information and data access. So these projects really took on a significant life. There were only 2 positions we added. One was early on, and that was an executive leadership liaison position to help coordinate all of the activities that the leaders were now doing. And then eventually we added someone to look at process improvement analysis in our work. But basically the work was done within the existing roles of people within the organization. That journey allowed us in 2013 to apply for the state version of the National Malcolm Baldrige Award. That state version measures all of the same things that I showed you earlier. It's interesting how the points work in terms of scoring. You see on number 7 results, it scored the highest at 450 points. It's really about getting the results that you want as an organization. But we were pleased to achieve the entry level. We got the bronze. There's a silver and gold. We didn't get there, but on our first effort, we were able to achieve, by using these processes, the bronze. So culture is everywhere, and it's deep-seated in your organizations. Organizations must be open and willing to change. Those that don't change will fall significantly behind or even go out of existence. Leaders must consistently address culture in making organizational change. While leadership starts with the CEO and top leadership, for an organization to thrive, you need to drive that organizational responsibility and ownership to the next levels of management, and multidisciplinary teams is what we found is the most effective ways to create organizational change. So, quote from Jack Welch, and I will move on to questions that you may have.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. Yeah, we're going to move on to begin answering some of the questions that were submitted. We have a few minutes, so one of the questions is, did you find the change to a performance-based culture difficult, and did you lose any staff in the process?
Yeah, good question. It really was a change for the organization. It required us to move through. You saw that it took multiple years to begin to change the culture. And yeah, we did lose people along the way as we expected different things from our managers, as we expected them to be responsible for running the organization. We introduced a lot of transparency. Everybody's budget was shared with every other leader in that executive, that second level, the management leadership team. Everybody knew what was going on in everybody else's program. We created reports that showed their performance and how they were doing. Some people really struggled with that level of accountability, that level of transparency. But we also found that people that embraced this really shared and began helping one another. When someone was struggling in one area, someone else would say, hey, I can help with that. Let's sit down and talk after this meeting and look at how my program can help your program.
Great. And one other question that often comes up, I think, as we talk to different agencies is, what is the value of addressing some of these issues at a program level, even if the entire agency isn't completely engaged in the reexamination of organizational culture? So, you know, is there some value in even looking at that from the program perspective?
Yes, absolutely. Our ultimate goal was to teach these skills at the program level. I mentioned all 120 of our managers were trained. We had identified organizational projects, and you could think of a cascading effect here also. There were going to be, 3 or 4 organizational projects we were tackling each year, but we really wanted to see the programs using these tools and techniques to address the work that they were doing. They were all extremely relevant. I think about in a residential program, whether it's medication distribution, how you account for the keys for the vans, all of those are processes. All of those have defects in them at different points in time, and all can very well be addressed at a program level. For a parent partner, what does that telling of your story look like? How does one do it? How does one begin to look at the process of telling your story? All of those can really be driven into a program level of the organization.
All right. Well, thank you, Bill. We are running out of time, so I just want to thank everyone for attending today's webinar. If you have any other questions that you were not able to submit, please contact me at yvette.kelly@nyu.edu. Once you leave today's webinar, you will also receive a survey on the presentation. We ask and would appreciate it if you could complete it and provide your feedback. And you will also receive a follow-up email within 24 to 48 hours with a link to view the recording of today's webinar, as well as instructions around getting the CU credit for today. On behalf of CTAC and our presenter, we'd like to thank you once again for joining us today, and have a great rest of your afternoon. Thank you.